Welcome everybody to the second Superpowers revision session looking at inquiry question 2. Now this time inquiry question 2 focuses down on this main question. What are the impacts of superpowers on the global economy, political systems and the physical environment? Now, this leads on from EQ1, where we clearly defined what superpowers are and how they operate. Just to remind you, this is not a replacement for the class learning that you've conducted. This is for revision only, and you will not pass those exams just using this. Use this alongside your class notes and your extra reading. Okay, let's begin. So the first part of EQ2 focuses down on transnational corporations or transnational companies, and looking in particular at the power of TNCs. That was the first bit of EQ2 that you looked at. And in this first lesson of EQ2, you'd have understood the global importance of TNCs and how they are influenced by global cultures. So let's delve back into a bit of a reminder of what you did. So you started by making a fair few notes on transnational corporations in general, looking at how they allow superpowers and emerging powers to spread that global influence around the world. And that's based on two things, based on their economic power and their cultural power as well. And we then looked at the different ways in which TNCs can do that. We then looked at how TNCs can dominate the economic landscape. Now, that dominance takes many different forms: production, sales, and that makes it possible for them to affect pricing. And if they can control pricing, they then have the equivalent of superpower status. We then briefly touched upon the control of technology globally through TNCs, with certain companies such as IBM we mentioned, and then looked at TNCs as language-free global brands, and that's where we mentioned companies such as McDonald's and Nike, and global media corporations such as Disney you'd have looked into. So you'd have then delved into some examples of transnational corporations, and you'd have looked at the biggest companies in the world, and these examples from 2016. We will then add a bit more meat to the bones, looking at what a TNC actually is, and in particular looking at two different types of TNCs: the public traded TNCs and then the state-owned TNCs. Slight difference in the two. Then we got you thinking about which transnational companies are the best well known, either the public or the state TNCs. We would have discussed this question: China has most of which type of TNC in their country? Which form of capitalism do TNCs support? And that's looking at particular TNCs located in particular countries. We'd have then discussed how do TNCs ensure dominance of the global economy? And then looked at the other side. What's the criticisms of transnational companies? So bringing in a bit of evaluation there. If you remember back, we had a huge discussion based on this list here of transnational corporations. What are they? How do they operate? What are their focus areas? And where are their headquarters? Then we delved into how transnational companies dominate that global economy. How do they do this? And this is where we brought in a bit of economics here, a bit of business studies as well, looking at what we call economies of scale. I mean, they can outcompete smaller companies and take them over. Looking at the wealth that these countries have in terms of their bank balances and their ability to borrow more money, to therefore invest more money. And then looking at the move towards the free market capitalism and free trade, which has opened up new markets, allowing TNCs to expand further. We then looked at how TNCs often need that investment, and then they will invest also themselves in developing countries. And big global TNCs have a lot of power, and they may be able to influence government policies in certain places around the world, both directly and indirectly. Now, global TNCs that dominate are easily recognizable, and we'd have discussed that at the time. The language free brands. And again, this is where we would revisit McDonald's and Nike again, looking at Disney and the Western culture that is spreading throughout the world. You would have then watched a very short clip looking at McDonald's as a particular example of westernization. And that's where we're bringing in the cultural influence that a TNC can have upon the people of a totally different nation compared to the US. Then, to round off this first part, you'd have completed the following tasks. Now, again, go back and revisit your notes, revisit the textbook as part of this. Page 148, 149 of the flag book, you looked at how and what cultural impact can TNCs have upon consumers, the people who these TNCs rely upon. What is westernization and how does it evolve? How has cultural globalization adapted in different parts of the world? And you'd have brought ideas in there such as globalization. And then explain how cultural traffic is not always from west to east, because a lot of the time we focus on the westernization, the Americanization, and the cultural influence that the West has on the East. But then thinking about the global rise of China and how Chinese culture and the China culture is starting to move westwards. And then looking at the role that the media plays and the roles of innovation and what we call patents. The second part of EQ2 is looking at international decision making and maintaining power. So at the end of this session, you'd have understood the role of superpowers as as a world governing body and the alliances that are forged due to this. So this is where we'd have gone into some depth on the UN Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. And if you have a look at that diagram to remind you there's the abbreviated mission of the United Nations, and then who are the members of the Security Council. So we'd have discussed at length the idea that some countries should act as what we call the world police, and the formation of the United Nations Security Council in 1946. And really the primary role which we would discuss is of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security. That's what it says on the first part of that mission list there. Now, we'd have then looked at the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and then the 10 rotating members of the Security Council. We'd look briefly at this idea of veto power, and is veto power necessary in the United Nations, and is it effective? Then we looked at the military interference, looking at the USA in particular, where the USA has intervened militarily in foreign countries on many different occasions over the last 40 years. And we'd looked at 3 different ways in which it's done so. First of all, the USA as part of the UN Security Council action, together with allied countries and what we call a coalition of countries, but also outside of that UN remit. Unilaterally, it's a good key term that you need to know, with no support from other countries at all. And then we looked at many cases that the UK and or France has also been involved. Rarely does China and Russia get involved, on the odd occasion. And this overall picture suggests that the USA and Europe share what we call geopolitical concerns, whereas Russia and China do not. And we looked at those competing ideologies and structures. We then looked at this map, looking at the blue and the red dots. The blue dots are where in the world some examples of UN actions involving the USA. So, for example, the Haiti intervention 1994 to 1995, looking at 1982 to 84, looking at the Lebanon. And then another example was the Somali civil war in 1992 to 95, where the UN acted involving the USA. But then looking at that unilateral side of things, where the red dots, the USA acting outside of the United Nations. And there's numerous examples on there: the invasion of Panama, the Bosnian War, the invasion of Grenada, the intervention in Libya, for example, the Iraq War, the war in northwest Pakistan, the war in northwest Afghanistan. So there's numerous examples there that we'd have discussed. We then brought in the idea of the United Nations peacekeepers and their role in the world to secure sections, areas of countries to try and avoid escalating conflict. Now, we'd have then looked at these international organisations, as you can see there, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, NATO, ANZUS, NAFTA, ASEAN. And which of these organisations fall into these categories? Which are military, which are economic, which are environmental, and which are political? And you'd have rounded off this particular part of the unit going back to the textbook to get some more depth. And again, revisit your notes. How can the UN Security Council maintain international law? How does the UN Security Council work in an imperfect way? Because it's not perfect. There are issues. How important are these military alliances when trying to maintain superpower status? What is NATO? So you'd have delved into NATO in more depth. What is NATO? Who are the member states? And why is NATO so important to the USA? Looking at the importance of economic alliance, and then you'd have delved into another example. What is ANZUS? ANZUS. Who's involved? Again, then you'd looked at NAFTA. What is NAFTA and what's its purpose? And then look at ASEAN and its purpose. So you'd have done a lot of notes, a lot of detail here to look at these organisations. The EQ2 then moves on to look at global environmental concerns. And by the end of this session, you've understood the disparity in resource use between superpowers and emerging countries. So here, we'd have started to discuss superpowers and emerging nations increasing their wealth and standard of living, and how they rely on the use of energy and other resources in the world to increase that wealth and standard of living. We'd have looked at the environmental damage that has been caused as a result of that, looking at river pollution, climate change, global sea level rise, scarring of the landscape, deforestation, increasing desertification. We'd have looked at discussed the demand for energy growth, which is getting higher and higher and higher, causing even more environmental catastrophe. Looking at environmentally sensitive areas such as the Arctic and the exploitation or the potential exploitation that could happen in the future. We will then have some in-depth discussion looking at superpowers such as the European Union, how they've become global leaders in tackling climate change. And also, sorry, look at the Kyoto Protocol and its role. We'd have then looked at China and how it's becoming one of the world's largest carbon emitters in 2007. Then we'd have looked at the current situation more recently, looking at China becoming a world leader in the renewable energy sector. So really, here we bring it all together where we look at the footprints, the ecological environmental footprint of superpowers, where maintaining a large economy, a large military with a large military machine with a global reach, uses resources. A good example of this is coal. And we looked here at China, which China accounts for 50% of the world's coal consumption. But only has 19% of the world's population. So there's less people using more of the resource of coal. China is the world's largest producer and importer of iron ore, a vital resource. And then looked at these figures. The 1,500 million tons mined in China of coal in 2014 only met demand when added to the 933 million tons imported. So you can see coal as a resource, it's a major resource for China. Then we looked at what has led to this increase in emissions. So, which factors cause the increase in emissions? Why have there been different rates of increase? What will happen as a result of this? Why may certain nations not be so willing to cut down on emissions? We then looked at and discussed this map looking at world coal consumption by region. So, bringing this all together, we then discussed and in some depth here, why has China's coal consumption increased? Looking at it as a developing nation, a newly industrializing country as part of the BRIC group of nations. Looking at its electricity generation, its industrial use, its domestic use, and all that demand for energy. But also looking at coal consumption decreasing in China, because China is starting to change due to strict regulations on coal consumption in cities in China to try and reduce the air pollution issue that Chinese cities have. We looked at this declined in US due to coal plant closures and mine retirements. Renewables are kicking it off the grid, so China, the US are starting to use more renewables. We then briefly looked at Europe. Germany and the UK in particular have made significant coal cuts. And at the time when we discussed this, there was whispers that the UK government is planning to get rid of completely by 2020, and they're well on the way to doing so. I then referred you down to this website, which enables you to look at particular cities and the environmental situation of some of these cities. You then had a task to go away and complete, which was to watch an interview with Leonardo DiCaprio, looking at who is responsible for reducing emissions and is it reasonable for countries to resist global initiatives in favour of their own industrial and financial development, like, for example, Donald Trump in the USA pulling out of the Paris Agreement. So then you had some tasks to do, again going back to the textbook to add a bit more depth. Revisit this, go back to the textbook, page 133 of the Lizard book. How have China, the USA, and Russia and the EU attempted to reduce emissions? Page 156 of the Flag book. Identify how emerging powers' carbon dioxide emissions are changing, and then how many of these emerging powers defend their usage, because emerging superpowers, some of them are the BRICS and the mints, are using more resources because they want to develop quicker. We then brought this into the rise of the middle class consumption. And again, this is where we come back to China, really. You were able to identify links between consumer lifestyles and energy consumption in emerging countries and superpowers such as China. So we had some pretty in-depth discussion here looking at the recent and predicted growth in resource consumption is enormous. China and India consuming large proportions of global resources. And a big part of this is China's middle class having overtaken that of the US to become the largest country in the world with the largest middle class. And there's a figure there. Some say as many as 500 million Chinese could enter the global middle classes over the next decade. We then spoke about the links between this and other units in other parts of this specification. So there was this question here, or statement here, it's already larger than the United States. That's China, the number of middle class adults. And you'd have watched this clip here. So again, revisit that. How would you define the middle class? So we then defined it. Globally, the middle class are defined as people with discretionary income, or what we sometimes call disposable income, who can spend that extra money after all the bills and so on to buy consumer goods and, for example, holidays. They're generally measured to have an annual income of over $10,000. Now, obviously, it's dependent on the country and whether you're classed as middle class or not. And then you'd have tackled this exam question using this resource, this figure, which shows the growth of global middle class spending by 2030. And you'd have described the projected changes in global middle class spending between 2009 and 2030. We then brought this on to look at the problems as a result of this growing middle class. And that graph is particularly useful there to really summarize all that you did previously. And this goes from 1960 up to 2010. And you can see the blue line there looking at the US middle class. And also this is the meat consumption in China and the USA, because as the middle class grow, they start to eat more meat, demand a different diet, and look at the growth in China. But then we'd have asked you to focus down on page 156 to 157 to complete a worksheet looking at that growth of China, the middle class, and meat consumption. So that concludes the EQ2 part of Superpowers. Watch this a few times. You must make sure that you go back to your class notes, you go back to the textbooks and the revision guides alongside this to help you focus on all the different parts of EQ2. Thank you very much, folks.